Welcome to this video on South African history. Today, we examine the South African Navy during World War II. This is the third part in the series on South African history during the war. In the last video, we covered the East African Campaign of 1940 to 1941 from the South African perspective. As the South African Army prepared to fight its first land battles on the far-off hills and grasslands of East Africa, the South Africans hastily assembled a navy to protect Allied convoys from Axis submarines off South Africa's coast and in the Mediterranean. Additionally, South African naval volunteers served on British ships from the Arctic Ocean to the South China Sea. By the end of the war, South Africa gained international recognition for its naval contributions and received 3 new frigates from Britain, which laid the groundwork for the post-war South African Navy. If this story of South African naval history interests you, then please keep watching. Before we begin the story of South Africa's Navy in World War II, let's examine the country's naval history before the Second World War. While unofficial South African naval history extended back to 1885, the modern South African Navy officially originated in 1922 when the South African Naval Service and the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve were formed to protect South Africa's territorial waters. In the same year, the Naval Service acquired 4 ships from Britain's Royal Navy. The Thames was the first ship the British gave to the South African Navy. It was a Mersey-class protected cruiser built by Pembroke Dockyard of Wales in 1885. Once in the hands of the South Africans, the ship was renamed the General Botha in honor of their first Prime Minister. Aside from a name change, it also had its cannons, torpedoes, and machine guns removed as it was converted from a well-armed warship into a training ship moored at the Simonstown Naval Base near Cape Town. Here, the first class of 75 naval cadets came aboard in 1922 and served in the Royal Navy after graduation. By 1925, the South Africans removed the ship's engines and funnels to make room for new recreation spaces, bigger kitchens, and even a gymnasium. The second ship given to the South Africans was the Hunt-class minesweeping ship HMS Crozier, which was built in 1919. When the South Africans acquired the Crozier in 1922, they renamed it Protea, after the flowering bush of the same name. While the ship was armed with a QF 3-pounder Vickers naval gun, the South Africans chose to remove it since they were converting the Protea into a hydrographic survey vessel responsible for mapping the seafloor around Cape Town. The final 2 ships given to South Africa were named Eden and Foyle, but the South Africans renamed them Immortelle and Sunblom, respectively. Both of these ships were small Mersey-class trawlers, and the South Africans used them for coastal patrols around Cape Town harbor. With these 4 new ships, the South Africans had a formal navy for the first time in their history. However, this force would not last forever. The 1929 Great Depression strained government funds, and politicians began to view these ships as too expensive to maintain. Because of this, the remaining seaworthy ships were returned to the Royal Navy between 1933 and 1934. From 1934 to 1939, the South African Navy had fewer than 10 employees, most of whom taught naval cadets on the General Botha training vessel at the Simonstown Naval Base. While the reduced importance of a navy helped save money during peacetime, the South African government quickly increased naval funding once it joined World War II in September 1939. This increase in funding was made in response to the threat Germany posed to the country. Despite being very far away from South Africa, Germany's well-armed, long-range Type 9 submarines could easily reach South African ports and attack shipping lanes with torpedoes for up to 3 months without resupplying. To coordinate an effective response to this threat, Prime Minister Smuts called the British Rear Admiral Guy Halifax out of his retirement in Cape Town in the fall of 1939, appointing him the director of the South African Naval Service. A few months later, in early 1940, the Naval Service was renamed to the Seaward Defense Force. In the meantime, Halifax and Prime Minister Smuts reinstated a government policy from World War I, which called for civilian vessels and fishing trawlers to be converted into anti-submarine maritime patrol craft. Over the next 5 years, 87 of these patrol boats became operational, according to the South African Naval Heritage Trust. With these new ships, the Seaward Defense Force took over responsibility from the Royal Navy for operating minesweepers, anti-submarine patrols, and rescue missions in South African waters. One of these ships was the Africana. Before the war, it was owned by the South African Department of Sea Fisheries, where it was used to research South Africa's marine ecosystems and monitor fish populations. However, on September 10, 1939, the ship was requisitioned by the South African government and turned into a search and rescue craft. On one mission in 1942, the vessel rescued dozens of survivors from the American cargo ship Anne Hutchinson, which was sunk near East London by the German U-boat 504's torpedo attack. The ship's last mission was in 1945, when the crew rescued 49 survivors from the Canadian merchant ship Point Pleasant Park, which was sunk by a torpedo attack from the German U-boat 510 off the coast of Lüderitz Bay. These attacks were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a dedicated Axis submarine offensive from 1942 to 1945 that sank over 100 ships off the South African coast. However, South African patrol ships protected countless more merchant ships and even sank 3 submarines throughout the war. While most of the Seaward Defense Force's efforts were directed toward protecting merchant ships in South Africa's sovereign waters, South African escort ships of the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group were sent to protect Allied convoys in the Mediterranean Sea. This group consisted of the Proeda and 4 former German-built whaling ships named Southern Flow, Southern Isles, Southern Sea, and Southern Maid. These ships arrived in South Africa from Vegesack, Germany in 1936, and were requisitioned by the South African government in 1940. By 1941, they were docked in Alexandria, Egypt, serving as escort ships for convoys sailing to Tobruk, Sicily, and Gibraltar. Here, the South African sailors earned a reputation for good discipline, morale, and marksmanship. In conjunction with the Seaward Defense Force's anti-submarine operations, 2,937 South African sailors volunteered for service in the Royal Navy through the South African Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Here, South African sailors served on over a dozen British ships, like the HMS Nelson, Cornwall, Dorsetshire, Neptune, Hermes, Orion, and Adamant. Aboard these ships, South Africans were deployed on missions in the Far East, in the North Atlantic, in the Arctic Ocean, and in the Mediterranean Sea. While on these missions, more than 100 South African volunteers would die. For instance, the HMS Gloucester was sunk in 1941 by German Stuka dive bombers during the Battle of Crete, and regrettably, 28 South African sailors were not rescued in time and drowned. Another instance of South African losses came during the Easter Sunday raid of 1942, when Japanese carrier aircraft attacked and sank the HMS Cornwall and Dorsetshire in the Indian Ocean southwest of Ceylon, causing 38 South Africans to drown. While these are just 2 examples, they illustrate how unpredictable and dangerous life was for these South African sailors, who made unimaginable sacrifices for the Allied cause. Perhaps as an acknowledgment of South Africa's substantial contributions to the war, the British made plans in 1944 to entrust 3 new Loch-class anti-submarine frigates to the South Africans. This was part of a broader British policy of transferring small portions of their tremendous fleet to Commonwealth countries like South Africa, Canada, Malaysia, and New Zealand. The first of the three frigates Britain gave to South Africa was named Loch Cree, and was built by Swan, Hunter, and Wingham Richardson shipbuilders in Wallsend, England, between 1943 and 1944. This ship, like all Loch-class frigates, was well armed, with two triple-barreled Squid anti-submarine mortars, two depth-charge throwers, three anti-aircraft guns, and a single QF 4-inch Mark V naval gun. Aside from weaponry, the ship was equipped with state-of-the-art technology like the Type 227 surface radar and the Type 144 ASDIC underwater sonar. The ship escorted convoys with the 8th Escort Group of the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command along the western coast of the British Isles throughout the spring of 1945. In June, the Cree set out for Durban, South Africa. When it arrived on July 12th, it was renamed the Natal, after the Natal province where Durban Harbor is situated. The ship departed for the Far East on August 20th, 1945, after its crew spent much time refitting equipment in preparation for combat against the Japanese Navy. Throughout September and October, the Natal escorted convoys around Malaya and Singapore before guarding the port of Sabang, located at the northern tip of Sumatra Island in Indonesia. After several more weeks, the ship returned to South Africa since the war was over. The second of these frigates, named Loch Boisdale, was built from 1943 to 1944 by the Blythe Harbour and Dock Company from Northumberland, England, and had similar armaments, radar, and sonar to the Natal. It escorted convoys between Britain and France until the German surrender in May of 1945, when it was transferred to the South African Navy. It arrived in South Africa on June 30th, where its name was changed to the Good Hope after the Cape Province of South Africa. The final frigate the British transferred to the South Africans was the Loch Ard. It was built by Harland and Wolff shipbuilders in Belfast, Northern Ireland, between 1944 and 1945. It never served in the war, as Germany had already surrendered by the time the ship was completed. However, the Ard was transferred to the South African Navy in May 14th of 1945 and was promptly renamed the Transvaal after the South African province of Transvaal. This concludes the story of the South African Navy during World War II. After the war ended, requisitioned ships returned to their previous owners. Meanwhile, the newly acquired Natal, Good Hope, and Transvaal became an integral part of the post-war South African Navy. Immediately after the war ended in 1945, these three ships helped ferry South African troops back home and later escorted King George VI's royal yacht during his 1947 tour of South Africa. Ultimately, the South African Navy played a crucial anti-submarine role in World War II, while also providing thousands of well-disciplined naval volunteers for the Royal Navy. If not for the South African contributions to convoy defense, many more Allied merchant vessels would have been sunk by German and Italian submarines, and hundreds of stranded sailors would never have been rescued. This small country made large contributions to the Allied war effort, and its naval history from 1939 to 1945 speaks to the determination of South African sailors to make a difference in this global conflict. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know your thoughts on this video in the comments below, and I hope you have a great day.